A poor little girl, crying, says to the young billionaire, "I can't bear to see my brothers crying from hunger anymore. Please, take one of them with you." Upon hearing this, the billionaire felt a deep ache and was shocked by the place they called home. The merciless sun punished the city that afternoon. Thomas Parker adjusted his sunglasses as he stepped out of the black car, an understated yet luxurious model whose astronomical value only true connoisseurs would recognize. His driver opened the door with the precise timing of someone who had done it daily for the past 5 years. "Mr. Parker, welcome to the Hope Community Center." A middle-aged woman, gray hair tied in a simple bun, greeted him with a smile that was warmer than Thomas would have preferred. She extended her hand. He hesitated for a second before shaking it, trying to mask his discomfort with a well-rehearsed cordial smile. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Martha. I'm the center coordinator." She shook his hand with perhaps a bit too much enthusiasm. "We're so honored by your visit. The kids are excited to meet the man who saved our project." Thomas nodded politely, discreetly checking his watch. He had only 1 hour to finish this visit, an obligation his advisors insisted was essential to humanize your public image before the launch of his new financial app. At 35, Thomas Parker was the portrait of modern American success. Raised in a middle-class family, he became a billionaire before turning 30 thanks to a tech startup that revolutionized the financial market. The Tech Midas, they called him. Everything he touched turned to gold, or more precisely, skyrocketing stocks. The only problem was that Thomas had long ago discovered gold could be cold. The community center, on the other hand, overflowed with human warmth, a quality that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Children ran through the halls, their laughter echoing off walls decorated with colorful drawings. Teenagers gathered in small groups, some curious about the important visitor, others deliberately uninterested. "Our library was completely renovated thanks to your donation," Martha explained, as they walked down a narrow hallway. "Before, we only had a few donated books. Now we have computers, study tables, everything we needed." Thomas smiled mechanically, surveying the space with a clinical eye. The library was modest but functional. The computers, though basic, were new. A considerable improvement, no doubt, just a drop in the ocean compared to his personal finances. The tour continued. The computer room, the newly equipped kitchen, the freshly painted sports court. At each stop, Martha explained how Thomas's substantial donation, though for him it cost less than he spent monthly on his watch collection, had transformed the place. "What motivated you to invest in a community center in this particular neighborhood, Mr. Parker?" Martha asked as they crossed the central courtyard. Thomas recited the prepared response from his public relations team. "I believe in the transformative power of education and access to technology. These young people are our future, and they deserve the same opportunities I had." The lie flowed as smoothly as something repeated countless times. The truth, which he would never admit, was much simpler. His advisors had identified this charity as offering the best return of image for the investment. "Humanize yourself," they said. "People want faces, not just logos." In the center's kitchen, Thomas noticed food baskets neatly arranged on shelves. "They're donations for the most needy families," Martha explained, following his gaze. "We distribute them every week. It's never enough, but it helps." Thomas nodded without really absorbing the information. His eyes had already strayed to his watch. Still 20 minutes left in this carefully orchestrated visit, and he already felt exhausted. "Would you like to take a quick walk around the neighborhood?" Martha suggested as they left the center, "so you can see the center's impact on the community." Thomas was about to decline, but something stopped him, perhaps an unexpected flicker of curiosity, or maybe just the desire to escape the artificial environment of the center. "Sure, why not? I have a few minutes before my next meeting." The contrast between the community center and its surroundings was stark. While the center had been freshly painted and renovated with donation money, the nearby streets remained neglected by the local government. Broken sidewalks, piles of trash in some corners, houses improvised with flimsy materials. Martha talked non-stop, explaining how the center tried to be an oasis amid hardship. Thomas listened half-heartedly, lost in his own thoughts, already mentally preparing for a meeting with Chinese investors, thinking about the numbers he needed to present, the strategies to implement. Then it happened. At the corner of a particularly narrow street, while the group walked slowly, a small figure emerged from the shadows between two buildings. It was a little girl, far too small, even by the standards of the other children he had seen at the center. Dark, disheveled hair framed a pale face with protruding cheekbones. She wore a t-shirt that might have been pink once, but had faded into an indeterminate hue, clearly too big for her frail body. But it was her eyes that captured Thomas. Dark, intense, and disturbingly grown up in that child's face, eyes that had seen more than any child ever should. The girl approached, completely ignoring the two discreet security guards following Thomas at a distance. She stopped right in front of him, raising her gaze with disconcerting determination. "Are you the rich man who's helping the little school?" she asked, in a surprisingly clear and articulate voice. Thomas, caught off guard by her direct approach, only nodded. The girl kept her eyes on him, as if evaluating his response. Then, without warning, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't bear to see my brothers crying from hunger anymore. Please, take one of them with you." Her voice rose, choked by the sobs now streaming down her small face. Time seemed to freeze. The street noises faded. Even the air itself felt denser, heavier, as if those words had real substance. Thomas felt something inside him break. It wasn't subtle or metaphorical, it was physical, visceral, as though someone had hit a thin layer of ice beneath which he'd been walking for years without realizing it. "What? What's your name?" he asked, hardly recognizing his own trembling, hushed voice. "Amelie," the girl replied, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her oversized t-shirt. "I'm 5. She added that detail as though she needed to establish her credibility. The security guards approached, uncertain how to proceed, but Thomas dismissed them with a discreet gesture. "Amelie, where are your brothers?" She pointed toward a narrow alleyway behind her. "There. They're hungry, but they were scared to come." Thomas looked at Martha, who seemed genuinely surprised and concerned. "Do you know this child?" he asked quietly. Martha frowned, observing Amelie more closely. "She comes to the center sometimes for meals. We thought she lived with some relative nearby. She never mentioned siblings." Thomas looked around and noticed a small grocery store across the street. He made a sudden decision. "Wait here a moment," he said, striding decisively across the street. In the simple store, he ignored the curious stares of the clerk, who took in his obviously expensive suit. He quickly bought what he could find: bread, milk, fruit, cookies, yogurt, juice, and some chocolate bars. He paid with a large bill, refusing the change with a gesture. He returned to where Amelie waited, 2 bags of groceries in his hands. "Can you show me where your brothers are now?" he asked, more gently this time. Amelie's eyes widened at the sight of the bags, but she only nodded, extending a small, dirty hand to him. Thomas took it without hesitation. "My schedule for the rest of the day is cancelled," he told his driver, who was waiting a few yards away. "I'll come back on my own later." He followed Amelie down the narrow alley, carrying the bags of food in one hand and holding the girl's little hand with the other. Martha trailed after them, while the security guards kept their distance, visibly uncomfortable with the unforeseen situation. The alley opened into a vacant lot, partially hidden between abandoned buildings. There, under the shadow of a scraggly tree, were 2 small boys, identical twins, clinging to each other as though that might protect them from the world. "Liam and Luke," Amelie introduced, approaching her brothers. "They're 3. They're twins." The boys looked at Thomas with wide eyes, the same dark eyes as Amelie's, but still holding something childlike that hers had already lost. They were visibly dirty and thin, dressed in shorts and t-shirts that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. "I brought a man who's going to help," Amelie told her brothers with surprising authority in her small voice. "He has food." Thomas crouched, placing the bags on the ground and opening them. He pulled out a box of cookies and a loaf of bread, offering them to the twins first. The boys looked at Amelie, as if asking permission, a reflex that broke Thomas's heart. When she nodded, they carefully inched forward and took what was offered. eating immediately with the desperate hunger of those who truly have nothing. "Slow down," Amelie cautioned with a motherly authority. "Chew well." Thomas took out more items: yogurt, a banana, a chocolate bar. Amelie only accepted food after her brothers had eaten enough, another gesture that spoke volumes about the role she had assumed in that makeshift little family. Where do you live, Amelie?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl pointed beyond the vacant lot, where a cluster of improvised shacks extended, partially hidden by a graffiti-covered wall. "Over there, I can show you." Thomas nodded silently and picked up the grocery bags again. Amelie led her brothers by the hands with the efficiency of someone who did this every day. Martha followed, as shocked as he was. The path was narrow, the ground uneven. Thomas stumbled a few times, his Italian shoes clearly unsuited for the terrain. Finally, Amelie stopped in front of a structure that could barely be called a home. It was a shack built from scraps of wood, rusted metal sheets, and plastic tarps. The door was just an opening covered by a faded piece of cloth. Trash was piled around, not from carelessness, Thomas realized, but because the place seemed to be an extension of an unofficial dump site. "Here," Amelie said simply. Thomas felt his stomach twist, not from disgust, as he might have hours earlier, before seeing this child's eyes. It was something else entirely: anger, sadness, shame. May I look inside?" he asked, fearing the answer. Amelie nodded, pulling aside the cloth that served as a door and guiding her brothers in. Thomas followed, ducking to pass through the opening. Martha remained outside, silent. The interior was small and dark, lit only by the sunlight filtering through gaps in the makeshift structure. But it was surprisingly organized: a thin mattress on the floor, covered by a worn but clean sheet. A cardboard box turned upside down served as a table. Some kitchen utensils, a pot, 2 spoons, a blunt knife, were neatly arranged in another box. Most striking was the wall beside the mattress. Someone, Amelie, Thomas assumed, had taped up magazine clippings, pictures of food, of nice houses, of smiling families. A tiny altar of hope amid despair. Thomas set the grocery bags on the box that served as a table. Amelie immediately began to organize the food, storing perishables in the coolest corner of the shack and stacking the rest carefully, like treasures. Her movements were precise, efficient, entirely incongruent with her age. Do you live here alone?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. Amelie nodded, still organizing the groceries he had brought. "Mom went out to work," she said, her voice devoid of obvious emotion. "She left a long time ago. She never came back." Thomas swallowed hard. "How long, Amelie?" The girl shrugged. "Many moons. I used to count, but then I forgot." "And there's no one else? No relatives? No neighbor who helps take care of you?" Amelie shook her head. "Just me. I take care of the boys." Once again, her gaze met Thomas's with that unsettling intensity. "That's why I thought, if you took one of them, it would be easier. I could take better care of just one." She paused, looking at the twins, who were now eating chocolate on the mattress. "But you have to promise to give them food and not hit them." Thomas felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the flimsy wall, unsure if it would support his weight, but needing some form of support. A 5-year-old child offering to give up one of her siblings to a complete stranger because she couldn't feed both. A child taking on the role of mother and protector, making brutal survival calculations that no adult should ever have to make. He who traded millions daily without flinching, who had fired hundreds without a second thought, who lived in a world where the biggest concern was which private island to visit on vacation, had no words. In his silence, Amelie interpreted something else. Her small face took on a determined expression. "You can take both of them if you want." I'll manage." Her voice betrayed the first real crack in her composure. "Just, please take care of them, okay?" That was too much. Thomas felt tears, something he hadn't experienced in years, form in his eyes. He blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. "I'm not separating you, Amelie," he finally said, surprising even himself with the firmness in his voice. But I'll help, all of you. The girl studied him with that gaze that seemed to see through people. Promise. The word hung between them. A promise. When was the last time he'd made a real promise? Not a contract, not a business deal, but a true promise. I promise, he said, and something in his voice must have convinced Amélie because she visibly relaxed. I'll come back tomorrow with more food, Thomas added, and we'll figure out something better, a better place for you all. Amélie nodded, her expression a complicated mix of hope and caution. She must have heard promises broken before. Thomas left the shack a few minutes later, after assuring Amélie he would return the next day. He found Martha outside, her face streaked with unshed tears. I didn't know, she said, her voice trembling. I swear I didn't know. She comes to the center occasionally for meals, but never mentioned. I never imagined. Thomas nodded silently. There was no accusation in his heart. How could there be? He himself, with all his resources and supposed power, had never truly looked, never truly seen what was right in front of him. I'll be back tomorrow, he said simply, and not just with food. I'll find a way to really help them. As he walked back to the main street through the vacant lot and narrow alley, Thomas felt both strangely light and impossibly burdened at the same time. Something had changed, shifted. An uncomfortable truth, always at the edges of his awareness, now occupied center stage. What was the point of all his money, all his power, if children like Amélie and her brothers lived like this? Just a few miles from the skyscrapers where he traded millions daily. What did it say about the world he had built for himself, one they all collectively built, that a 5-year-old had to contemplate giving away a sibling so the other could eat? Thomas paused at the entrance of the alley, looking at the city stretched out before him. The gleaming high-rises in the distance, the expensive cars passing by, the people hurrying along, oblivious to the small human drama he had just witnessed. Oblivious as he had been until a few minutes ago. He pulled out his phone and cancelled all his appointments for the day and for the following week with a single message. Those children, those eyes. They had changed something fundamental inside him. He was no longer the same man who had left his luxurious penthouse that morning, planning only a quick charity visit to polish his image. As he walked back to the Hope Community Center, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the silence that followed Amélie's desperate request, that moment when time seemed to stand still, a silence that still reverberated inside him, a silence that would cost far more than any donation he had ever made. It would cost his complacency, his cultivated indifference, his ability to turn away. It was the most expensive silence he had ever encountered, and somehow he knew it would be worth every cent. Rain tapped against the window of Thomas's office. Seated in his Italian leather chair, he gazed at the city through the fogged glass, a skyline of skyscrapers standing as monuments to power and money, his empire, his world, yet his thoughts were miles away, in a small makeshift shack on the outskirts of town. It had been 3 weeks since the first encounter with Amélie. 3 weeks since that frail child with eyes far too old for her age had cracked his carefully crafted armor. 3 weeks spent sending food, clothes, and blankets. 3 weeks visiting regularly, always telling himself, just one more time, to make sure they're okay. Today, however, he felt reluctant, not because he was losing interest, quite the contrary. It was the intensity of his involvement that unsettled him, how those children had infiltrated his thoughts, his routine, how deeply he genuinely cared. And that was dangerous. That was not part of the plan. The merger documents need your signature by the end of the day, Mr. Parker, his secretary reminded him, interrupting his thoughts as she walked into the office. From her expression, it wasn't the first time she'd tried to get his attention. Yes, of course, leave them on the desk. She placed the leather-bound folder on the imposing mahogany desk and discreetly left. Thomas glanced at the papers without really seeing them. It was the acquisition of a promising startup, the kind of business that, weeks ago, would have consumed his attention for days. Now, it felt trivial. His phone buzzed. A message from Martha, the community center coordinator who helped him keep track of the children. Amélie asked about you today. She seemed disappointed when I said I wasn't sure if you were coming. Thomas felt a pang in his chest. He had told himself he would gradually reduce his visits, that he would find a more permanent solution for the children, maybe a foster family, maybe a more robust social assistance program, anything that didn't involve him getting more and more personally involved. But the image of Amelie's expectant eyes haunted him. Sighing, he signed the merger documents without fully reading them, something unthinkable for the Thomas of a month ago, and grabbed his coat. "Cancel my afternoon appointments," he instructed his secretary as he passed by. Something important came up. The rain had subsided when he arrived in the neighborhood where the children lived. Even so, the ground was muddy, forcing him to tread carefully. His Italian shoes, already worse for wear from previous visits, sank into the sludge as he followed the now familiar path. Martha was waiting by the entrance of the Hope Community Center, umbrella in hand. "She's inside," Martha said, pointing to the center. "She brought her brothers today. They're taking a hot shower and getting clean clothes." Thomas nodded, grateful. One of his first actions had been arranging for the children to use the center's facilities whenever they wanted, something that wouldn't have been possible without Martha's cooperation. "How are they?" "Physically, better. The twins are gaining weight. The new clothes help with the cold." Martha paused. "But Amelie, she's still the same. Too grown up. She's always on guard." Thomas understood. That wasn't something a few weeks of regular food could fix. The wound of abandonment, the responsibility placed on such small shoulders, that would take much longer to heal, if it ever did fully. He found Amelie sitting at a table in the rec room, a notebook open in front of her. The twins were nowhere in sight, probably still in the shower, supervised by a volunteer. She looked up as he approached, and Thomas saw something rare, a faint smile. "You came," she said, more as a statement than a surprise. "I did," Thomas confirmed, taking a seat across from her. "Sorry I didn't come yesterday." Amelie shrugged, an oddly grown-up gesture. "You have work. My mom had work too." The comparison caught him off guard. It was the first time she had mentioned her mother so directly since that first day, when she had simply explained her mom had left for work and never returned. "You miss her," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Amelie nodded, her gaze dropping to the notebook in front of her. That was when Thomas noticed it wasn't homework or random scribbles typical of a 5-year-old. The drawings were elaborate, colored with care and detail. "May I see?" he asked, indicating the notebook. Amelie hesitated for a moment, then turned the notebook so he could see. Thomas found himself looking at a drawing of a young woman, dark hair like Amelie's, holding hands with 3 small figures that had to be Amelie and the twins. They were all smiling, standing in front of what looked like a real house, not the shack they currently lived in. "Is that your mom?" he asked gently. Amelie nodded. "And us?" "In our new home when she comes back." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. The certainty in her voice was devastating. There was no doubt in her childish mind, but not so childish. Her mother would come back someday. "You draw very well," he commented, carefully turning the page. Another drawing. The same woman in a kitchen, apparently baking a cake. The twins at the table. Amelie helping. "Their memories," Amelie explained, watching Thomas flip through the notebook. "Memories from when your mum was with you." Amelie shook her head. "No, they're memories of the future, for when she returns." Thomas stopped, letting those words sink in. Memories of the future. Such a profound concept, coming from someone so young. "Made-up memories," Amelie continued, as if needing to explain. "I make up how it's going to be, draw them, and keep them. So I won't forget." Thomas closed the notebook carefully, handling it like something infinitely precious. And in a way, it was. Those pages held more than childish drawings. They contained the pure, raw resilience of a child who refused to give up, who constructed alternate worlds where her family was whole, where abandonment did not exist. "When did you start drawing these?" he asked, his voice rougher than intended. "After the food ran out." "Before you started bringing more." Amelie clutched the notebook to her chest. "When the boys cried a lot, I showed them the drawings, told them to just wait a little longer. Thomas felt something break inside him again. This wasn't the same shock as the first meeting, or the impotent rage of the early days. It was something deeper, more permanent. A tectonic shift inside him, altering the very ground of his soul. Here was a man who possessed more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, sitting before a child who had created treasure out of nothing, who had turned hope into something tangible, into brightly colored pages that comforted hungry siblings. "Amelie," he said, unable to hide the emotion in his voice, "you are incredible. Did you know that?" She stared at him, confused. Compliments were not part of her daily vocabulary. "Incredible because I take care of the boys?" she asked, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, not a responsibility no child should shoulder. "Partly, yes. But mostly because," Thomas gestured toward the notebook, searching for words, "because you don't give up, because you believe, because you create beauty when everything around you." He couldn't finish. How could he explain to a 5-year-old that she possessed a strength many adults, himself included, would never know? Amelie seemed to understand anyway. She gave that half smile again, so rare and precious, like a flower blooming in the cracks of concrete. "Want to see my favorite?" she asked, opening the notebook again. Thomas nodded, grateful for the change in tone. Amelie flipped through until she found the desired page. This drawing was different from the others. It showed her mother returning, a dark-haired figure walking toward the shack, arms open, the 3 children running to meet her, and a short distance away, but clearly part of the scene, there was another figure, a man in a suit. "That's you," Amelie explained, pointing. "On the day my mom comes back." Thomas looked at the drawing, feeling the world spin around him. There he was, included in Amelie's future memories, part of her rebuilt future. Not a temporary visitor or a distant benefactor, but someone who would be there in the most important moment of their lives. He began, at a loss for words. He couldn't promise he would be there. He couldn't feed hopes that might never come true. But he also couldn't bring himself to dismantle that carefully constructed image. "Thank you for including me." Amelie closed the notebook, seemingly satisfied. "The boys must be done bathing by now," she announced. "I need to see if they're behaving." And with that, she returned to her role as the little caretaker, the older sister in charge. Thomas watched her leave the room, the notebook of future memories held tightly against her chest. A treasure indeed. He remained alone in the recreation room for a long time, staring at the spot where Amelie had been sitting, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Something had changed within him irreversibly. The cracks in his routine, in his priorities, in his worldview were no longer mere fissures, they were chasms. "She showed you the drawings," Martha said, returning to the room with a tray of tea. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, accepting the cup she offered. "Have you seen them?" "Some. She draws here sometimes when she brings the boys. The art teacher gave her that notebook, those pencils." Martha sat down, her expression serious. "Thomas, you realize what's happening, don't you?" He sipped the tea, buying time. "What do you mean?" "Those children are getting attached to you, especially Amelie. You're becoming consistent, reliable." Martha chose her words carefully. "That's wonderful, but it's also a huge responsibility." Thomas knew that. It was precisely what terrified him, what had made him hesitate about coming today. It wasn't just about providing food or clothes. He was becoming someone these children depended on, someone who featured in their future, someone who was part of their invented memories. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted finally. "I don't know how to be what they need." "Nobody does in the beginning," Martha replied gently. "Do you think I knew how to run this center when I started? Do parents know how to raise kids when they have them? We learn by doing, by failing, by trying again." Thomas looked out the window. The rain had completely stopped, leaving the sky with that peculiar clarity that comes after a storm. Outside, in the courtyard, Amelie was playing with the twins, watching as they ran in circles, trying to catch one another. They wore clean clothes, their hair still damp from the bath, looking cranes for a brief moment, like normal kids. "What do you think I should do?" he asked, still watching them. Martha followed his gaze. The question is, what do you want to do? Thomas thought about it. What did he want? Weeks ago, he would have said he wanted only to give brief help, ease his conscience, maybe find an institutional solution, and return to his life. Now he wasn't sure. The image of Amelie's drawing remained vivid in his mind. Himself, part of the future of those children, part of the reconstruction they so desperately longed for. "I want to do whatever is best for them," he finally said. Martha smiled, and as though she'd been expecting that answer exactly. "Then start by listening. Listening to Amelie, the twins, what they say and what they don't say, what they draw, what they dream about." She gestured toward the courtyard. "Amelie trusted you today, showing you that notebook." "It's a start." Thomas nodded slowly, listening. It sounded simple, almost trivial, but he realized now it was something he rarely did, truly did. In his world of business and power, listening was often just a formality before imposing his own will. With Amelie, it would have to be different. He'd have to learn to listen, not to respond, but to understand. Not to solve, but to be present. "I'll try," he promised, more to himself than to Martha. When he left the community center that afternoon, Thomas carried with him more than the memory of Amelie's drawings. He carried resolve. The cracks in his routine, which once bothered him, now seemed like opportunities, spaces where something new could grow, if he let it. Back at his office, the documents waited. Emails piled up, calls went unanswered. His former life carried on, relentless in its demands, but inside him, something had changed irreversibly. His priorities had rearranged themselves. The certainties that had once seemed so solid now felt distant and unclear. And somewhere inside that man who once measured everything's value in numbers and charts, a sacred space had formed, a space where he carefully held the image of a little girl drawing impossible futures, a space where, perhaps, he himself could learn to draw new futures too. He didn't know what he would do next. For the first time in years, he had no plan, but he knew that whatever path he chose, he had to honor the trust Amelie had placed in him. He had to be worthy of appearing in her future memories. And that, somehow, felt like the most important thing he had ever done in his entire life. For 3 days straight, the rain fell relentlessly. Thomas watched from his office window as heavy drops streamed down the glass, distorting the view of the city below. His mind, however, was miles away, on that little shack where 3 children struggled to survive. Amelie, Liam, and Luke. 3 names that, inexplicably, had become essential to his life in recent weeks. 3 children who had accomplished what no partner, lover, or friend ever had. They had breached the carefully constructed barriers around his heart. On his desk lay a folder containing everything he had managed to find out about Laura Mendez, the missing mother. It wasn't much. A faded photograph that Amelie guarded like a treasure, discreetly copied so as not to alert the girl. Basic information from Martha, approximate age, physical description, last known address, and most importantly, the approximate date she had disappeared, about 4 months earlier. Thomas had hired a private investigator, a discreet, efficient man used to finding people who didn't want to be found. He hadn't questioned why a billionaire was interested in the whereabouts of a poor woman from a struggling neighborhood. He'd simply taken the case, along with a generous payment. The phone rang, interrupting Thomas's thoughts. "Mr. Parker, Investigator Ramirez is here to see you. Send him in." Ramirez was a middle-aged man, athletic build hidden beneath inexpensive suits. He entered without ceremony, a folder under his arm. "I have some information," he announced, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. One of the qualities Thomas appreciated in him, the lack of artificial deference. "What did you find?" "Fragments, mostly." Ramirez opened the folder, spreading out some photos and documents on the desk. Laura Mendez was admitted to East City Hospital about 3.5 months ago. Severe pneumonia, malnutrition. She stayed for 2 weeks. Thomas processed the information, doing some mental calculations. That admission would have happened shortly after she disappeared from the shack where she lived with her kids. She left the hospital on her own, Ramirez continued, against medical advice. The records show she was still weak, needed follow-up care. Where did she go after that? That's where it gets complicated. From what I could trace, she had her documents stolen while in the hospital. No ID, no money, no physical condition to return home. Ramirez paused, making a gesture to show how dire the situation was. So she stayed on the streets, Thomas concluded. Probably. There are records of her at 2 temporary shelters in the following weeks. She never stayed more than a few nights. After that, Ramirez shrugged in frustration. She vanished. Thomas studied the grainy security camera images Ramirez had found. They were low quality, but they showed a woman matching Laura's description. Too thin, vacant eyes, that look of someone merely surviving. Nothing more recent. Ramirez shook his head. No record in the past 2 months. It's like she disappeared into thin air. I have some contacts checking homeless camps and unofficial shelters, but so far, he shrugged again, I'll keep looking. Thomas nodded, an unsettling feeling taking root in his chest. It was as if Laura Mendez had been swallowed up by the city, by poverty, by a collective indifference that allowed people to simply vanish without a trace. Keep looking, he said. Any lead, no matter how small. Ramirez gathered the documents, leaving Thomas a copy of the hospital records. One thing puzzles me, the investigator said before leaving. From what I found, she seemed determined to return to her kids. A nurse noted she kept repeating it during her high fever. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. A sick mother, desperate to get back to her children, blocked by cruel circumstances. Thank you, Ramirez. Keep me updated. After the investigator left, Thomas stayed in his office, contemplating the rain which had intensified, now a raging storm. The same thought tormented him. While they spoke comfortably there, Amelie and the twins were in that shack, likely drenched by water leaking in through the flimsy roof. He picked up his phone and dialed Martha. How are they? Martha's worried voice came through. Not good, Thomas. The entire area is flooded. I brought them to the center today, but I can't keep them here indefinitely. It's that bad. Worse than you can imagine. Their shack, part of it collapsed last night. If it wasn't for Amelie, who noticed the cracks and got the boys out in time. Thomas felt his stomach churn. Children alone in a storm, in a collapsing shack. I'm on my way, he said decisively, and I'm not leaving without them. 90 minutes later, Thomas parked in front of the Hope Community Center. Rain still poured mercilessly, turning the unpaved streets into rivers of mud. The entire area looked like a disaster scene. Partially destroyed shacks, soaked belongings, people trying to salvage what little they had. Martha met him at the door, worry etched on her face. They're in the back room. I got them dry clothes, a hot meal. The twins are okay, but Amelie... What happened to her? She has a fever. Probably just a cold from being out in the rain. Nothing serious yet, but... Thomas followed Martha through the now familiar hallways. In the small room at the back, he found the twins asleep on an improvised mattress ease wrapped in blankets. Amelie sat beside them, her back straight, her eyes watchful even as her own body showed clear signs of illness. She looked at him, and something in her gaze lit up, quickly replaced by her usual wariness. "Did they come to take us away?" she asked, her voice husky. Thomas frowned, confused. "Who would take you away?" "The government people. The ones who separate siblings." Thomas's heart clenched as he realized she was referring to Child Protective Services. She feared more than anything that her little family would be split up. "No," he replied, sitting beside her. "No one's going to separate you. I came because I was worried." Amelie relaxed a little. Her eyes, usually so alert, looked feverish, slightly unfocused. "Our house fell," she said, with that disarming honesty that always threw him off balance. "I know. Martha told me," Thomas answered softly. "Amelie, you can't go back there." The girl nodded, surprising him. "I know, I don't have anywhere to keep the boys now." That word, keep. As though her brothers were treasures she needed to protect. And weren't they, in a way? "I found a place for you to stay," Thomas went on. "Somewhere safe, warm, dry, with food every day." Amelie studied him with that penetrating gaze. "For how long?" "As long as you need. Until..." He hesitated. "Until he found a permanent solution. Until the broken social systems finally worked. until he found their mother. Until when? Amelie insisted. Until you're truly safe. All of you. The little girl looked at her sleeping brothers, then back at Thomas. Okay, she agreed at last, with the seriousness of someone finalizing a business deal. But only if we stay together. I promise. 2 hours later, after hasty arrangements and some phone calls demonstrating the power of the Parker name, Thomas drove a car through the gates of a discreet property on the outskirts of the city. It was a large house, originally intended as a rehabilitation clinic for wealthy families. Now it had been hastily converted into a temporary shelter for 3 abandoned children. Amelie watched everything from the window, her feverish eyes wide as they took in the lit-up house. The twins, drowsy, barely registered the change. "Here?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "Here," Thomas confirmed. At least for now. Employees were already waiting. A nurse to check the children's health, especially Amelie's lingering fever, a cook who had prepared a simple but nourishing meal, a child psychologist specializing in trauma, carefully selected by Thomas among the best professionals in the city. Amelie watched everything suspiciously. She allowed the nurse to examine her only after the twins were seen first. She accepted food only after making sure her brothers had enough. When bedtime came, she insisted on sharing a room with them, despite the abundance of space. Thomas observed her, recognizing in her protective gestures a distant echo of his own childhood. Not the poverty. His parents had left him financially secure when they died in an accident, but the feeling of being uprooted from a safe world and thrust into another, harsh and unpredictable. In the following days, Thomas split his time between his office and the shelter, establishing a new routine that baffled his partners and employees. The ruthless billionaire, renowned for his obsessive dedication to work, now vanished for hours without explanation. The truth, which he never voiced, was that he felt more at peace there, at the house on the outskirts of town, watching Amelie and the twins gradually adjust to comfort and security. Amelie's fever subsided. The twins were visibly gaining weight, and even the girl's constant vigilance seemed to relax, if only slightly. One particularly calm afternoon, almost a week after they moved to the shelter, Thomas found Amelie sitting in the garden, her future memories notebook on her lap. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her concentration. "I made a new one," she said without looking up from her drawing. "Can I see?" Thomas asked, sitting beside her on the bench. Amelie turned the notebook toward him. The drawing depicted the new house where they were staying, front and center, clearly identifiable, despite the childlike lines, were Amelie and the twins. Next to them, a female figure, presumably their mother, whom they still awaited. A short distance away, but undeniably present, was Thomas. "All of us," Amelie explained, pointing at the figures. "All of you," Thomas agreed, feeling a lump in his throat. "Have you discovered where my mum is?" Amelie asked, catching him off guard with her direct question. Thomas hesitated. He didn't want to lie to her, ever, but he also didn't want to destroy her hope. "Not exactly," he answered. "I found out a few things. She was sick, in the hospital." Amelie's eyes grew big. "A hospital, like yours?" "Not as expensive as the ones I use," Thomas said gently. "A public hospital. Did she get better?" Thomas thought about the hospital records Ramirez had found, the early discharge, against medical advice. "She got a bit better, yes, but she wasn't fully recovered when she left." Amelie processed this, considering its importance. "Then she didn't abandon us," she concluded finally, her small voice steady. "She got sick. She couldn't come back." Thomas nodded, again admiring the capacity of this child to cut to the heart of the matter. "That's what it looks like." "Yes, everything points to her wanting to return to you." Amelie closed the notebook, hugging it against her chest. "I knew it," she said simply. That evening, after dinner, Thomas prepared to leave. He had important meetings the next morning, documents that needed his attention, an empire that continued to function despite his newfound concern for 3 abandoned kids. "Are you coming back tomorrow?" Amelie asked, watching him grab his coat. "I'll try," Thomas answered honestly, "but I might only manage the day after. I have some important meetings." She nodded, accepting that explanation without showing disappointment. She was used to not demanding anything, used to having no guarantees. "The boys will go to sleep soon," she announced, glancing at the twins, who were quietly playing in a corner of the room. "I already gave them their medicine." Thomas smiled at her ever-watchful care of her brothers, even now that capable adults were around to do it. "The nurse can handle that, Amélie. You don't have to worry about everything anymore." She shrugged, an adult-like gesture once again. "They like it when I do it." Thomas knelt to meet her gaze. "You're safe here," he said, feeling the need to reaffirm it. "All of you. You can rest now." She studied him with those eyes that always saw more than they should. "Thanks," she said simply. Then, surprising him, she stepped forward and hugged him briefly. It was a quick, almost hesitant hug, as though she wasn't used to physical displays of affection. But for Thomas, it felt as if something broke and was rebuilt inside him. "Good night, Amélie," he managed, voice slightly choked. "Take care, and let them take care of you for once." He walked out into the cool night air, feeling both strangely light and impossibly heavy. In the car, heading to his empty, luxurious downtown apartment, he thought about the fragments of Laura Mendez's story he'd uncovered, about a mother's desperate fight to return to her children, thwarted by a system seemingly designed to keep the poor in their place. He also thought about his own childhood, his parents lost too soon, the distant uncle who became his legal guardian but never a true caregiver, the boarding schools where he learned to build walls around his emotions, the fortune he had inherited and multiplied, as though money could fill the void of abandonment. The difference he now saw was that he had been abandoned by death, an irrevocable force no one could fight. Amélie and her brothers had been abandoned by circumstances, by poverty, by the cruelty of a world that let sick people lose their ID and with it, their identity, their path back home. His phone vibrated in his pocket. It was Ramirez. "Any news?" Thomas asked straight away. "Nothing concrete yet, but I have a lead. A woman matching her description was seen at a shelter in the western part of town 3 weeks ago. She only stayed one night." "Keep looking," Thomas instructed. "Expand the search radius. She may have left the city. That'll make it a lot harder." "I know, but don't give up." Thomas hung up, feeling the weight of the unspoken promise he'd made to Amélie, to find her mother, to reunite a broken family, to give a happy ending to a story that felt destined for tragedy. It wouldn't be easy. It might be impossible, but he realized with crystal clarity that he could no longer simply turn his back and return to his old life. He was invested now, in a way he had never been before. As his car glided through the bright downtown streets, so different from the dark, flooded alleys where he first met Amélie, Thomas made himself a promise. He would not rest until he found Laura Mendez, until he completed the puzzle of that shattered family, until he brought to life the future memories Amélie drew with such faith. It was an ambitious promise, perhaps impossible to keep. But in recent weeks, he had discovered that some things were worth risking failure. And this, undoubtedly, was one of them. After weeks of ceaseless rain, the sun finally came out. Its rays streamed through the windows of the shelter, painting golden patterns on the polished wooden floors. Thomas arrived early that morning, carrying a few bags of clothes for the children, not brand new but of good quality, donated by a children's store owner who owed him a favor. Martha greeted him in the front hallway, her smile less tense than in previous days. "Amélie's been up since dawn," she said. "She woke up with the first rays of sun. The twins were still asleep when I checked on them a few minutes ago." Thomas set the bags on a side table. "How is she?" "Different today," Martha replied, a slight crease in her brow. "More excited. I can't quite put my finger on it. Maybe it's just the sun after so long." Thomas made his way down the familiar corridor to the small living area where Amélie usually spent her mornings. He found her standing in front of a full-length mirror, tying her dark hair with a brightly colored ribbon. She spotted him in the reflection and turned. "Thomas," she exclaimed, her eyes shining with an unusual sparkle. "You came early today." "I brought some clothes for you guys," he explained, noticing how different she seemed, not just because of her hair, carefully arranged, or the clean, pressed dress she was wearing. It was something in her posture, a quiet energy that hadn't been there before. "I need nice clothes for the boys today," Amelie said, a gentle determination in her voice. "I'm going to wake them up now." Thomas followed her to the room she shared with the twins, intrigued by this change in her demeanor. The boys were still fast asleep, bundled in warm blankets, such a luxury compared to the shack where they once lived. Amelie approached the bed and gently shook Liam's shoulder. "Wake up, sleepyhead," she called, her voice soft yet commanding. "It's an important day." Thomas watched, fascinated, as she repeated the process with Luke. The twins woke slowly, still drowsy, rubbing their eyes. "Day?" Luke asked, the chattier of the two. "A sunny day," Amelie answered, already pulling back the curtains to let in more light. "A special day." Thomas stayed at the door, not wanting to interrupt this ritual that clearly mattered to Amelie. She moved with contained energy, picking out clean clothes from the little wardrobe, washing the twins' faces with a damp towel, combing their hair with meticulous care. "Why is it a special day?" Thomas finally asked, his curiosity winning out over discretion. Amelie glanced up, her hands busy buttoning Liam's shirt. For an instant, she looked surprised by the question, as if the answer were too obvious to need stating. "Because it's sunny," she said simply. Then, lowering her voice, and she added, "She might come back today." In that moment, Thomas understood. Their mother, Laura Mendez. That was why Amelie was dressing her brothers so carefully, why her eyes shone so brightly. In her child's mind, a child forced to grow up too quickly but still a child, the mother's reappearance was tied to the sun. Maybe because Laura had left on a sunny day, maybe because, for Amelie, her mother and the sun both brought warmth and light. Something inside Thomas broke again. It wasn't a violent rupture, but rather like a dam slowly giving way under the unrelenting pressure of water, until a crack formed and it could hold no more. A knot grew in his throat, a heaviness in his chest he couldn't name. "Amelie," he began, not sure what to say. How could he explain that weeks of searching had yielded only fragments, false leads, and frustrated hopes? But the girl smiled, a rare smile, brimming with a certainty no adult could fully fathom. "Did you bring nice clothes?" she asked, deftly changing the subject while double-checking Luke's buttons. "The boys need to look good when she comes." Thomas merely nodded, swallowing the cautionary words he'd almost said. "They're in the other room. Let's have breakfast first, and then you can pick out whatever you want for them." The morning proceeded with a dreamlike quality. Amelie, usually so serious and reserved, seemed to float around the house, tidying, arranging, preparing. After breakfast, she threw herself into selecting the nicest items from the clothes Thomas had brought. She chose carefully, like a little stylist, matching colors and checking sizes. "This for Liam," she decided, holding up a light blue shirt. "It goes with his eyes." Thomas observed her, awed by her determination to maintain hope against all odds. How much easier would it have been simply to give up, to accept her mother's absence as permanent? Yet Amelie refused. For her mother's return was not a question of if, but when. As morning turned into afternoon, a new feeling began to form within Thomas, something he couldn't yet name, something that sprouted like a seed planted in fertile ground. A resolution, a decision taking shape, not as a conscious thought but as a deep, unshakable certainty. "I need to step out for a few hours," he announced after lunch. "I'll be back before dinner." Amelie looked up from the puzzle she was assembling with the twins. A flicker of worry crossed her face. "Will you really come back today? It's important." "I promise," he said, matching her seriousness. "I wouldn't miss this day for anything." In his car, driving through the city streets, Thomas made a call. "Ramirez, I need that last lead you mentioned, the shelter in the western area. I want the exact address." "I thought we'd ruled that out," the investigator replied, sounding surprised. "The woman only stayed one night and didn't fully match the description." "It's all we've got," Thomas insisted, "and today, I have a feeling we should check again." There was something in his voice that brooked no argument. Ramirez gave him the address without further objections. The shelter was in a run-down neighborhood, a mix of abandoned buildings and small businesses secured behind heavy metal grates. Thomas parked his car, purposely choosing a discreet model, and walked to the entrance. It was a simple place but clean, run by a religious organization that offered beds and hot meals to people on the streets. Residents had to leave during the day to look for work or attend to personal matters. A tired but kindly middle-aged woman examined the register list when Thomas walked in. "May I help you?" she asked, clearly puzzled by the presence of a well-dressed man in her establishment. Thomas briefly explained his mission, showing the faded photo of Laura, detailing her characteristics, mentioning the children who waited for her. The woman shook her head apologetically. "So many people pass through here. It's hard to remember every face." Thomas was about to leave when a young volunteer approached, drying her hands on an apron. "I think I know that woman," she said hesitantly. "She was here a few weeks ago, didn't stay long, she kept to herself, hardly spoke." Thomas's heart quickened. "Do you know where she went?" The young woman shrugged. "Not exactly, but I heard her mention the church square near the municipal market. I think she found some cleaning job around there. It wasn't much, but at that moment, it felt like a breakthrough." Thomas thanked her warmly, left a generous donation for the shelter, and immediately headed to the mentioned location. The church square was a large, tree-lined area, surrounded by small shops and street vendors. Elderly women fed pigeons on benches. Children played near the central fountain. Workers rested in the shade. Thomas circled the perimeter, studying each face, mentally comparing them to the faded photo in his pocket. He walked past the market, where vendors shouted out fruit and vegetable prices. Nothing. He was about to give up when he saw her. Not in the square, but in a side alley, stepping out from behind a small diner. She carried a bucket and a broom, her face tired, thinner than in the photo, her hair tied in a messy bun. But it was undoubtedly her, the same eyes as Amelie, the same determined expression despite her evident exhaustion. Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Laura Mendez." She stopped, shoulders instantly tensing. Her eyes studied him with suspicion. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Parker. I know your children." The effect was immediate. The bucket slipped from her hands, spilling dirty water. Her face went pale, eyes wide with a mix of hope and fear. "Amelie? The boys? Are they—" "They're okay," Thomas said quickly. "They're safe. In a good place." Laura staggered as though her legs could no longer support her. Thomas caught her elbow, guiding her to a small bench. How did you find them?" she asked, her voice shaking. Thomas gave a brief account, meeting Amelie on the street, her desperate request, the visit to the shack, the collapse during the storm, moving them to a shelter. Laura listened in silence, tears rolling down her cheeks without her seeming to notice. "I tried to come back," she said at last, voice trembling. "I got sick, lost my documents in the hospital. When I finally got out, I had no bus fare, couldn't remember the exact route. Each day I tried a different direction." Thomas believed her. He saw the desperation in her eyes, her calloused hands, her painfully thin frame. The story of a nearly impossible fight against a system designed to keep people trapped. "Amelie never lost hope," he said gently. She believes you'll return." "My girl," Laura whispered, tears now streaming freely. "My little warrior." Thomas extended his hand in a simple gesture of offering. "Would you like to see them?" he asked. "They're waiting." Laura looked up as though she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "Right now, but She glanced at her worn clothes, her dirty hands, her overall condition. Thomas understood immediately. "So there's a place where you can clean up, change. I have everything in my car, and then yes, we can go see them." 2 hours later, after stopping by a small hotel where Laura could shower and put on clean clothes Thomas had brought, they reached the shelter. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in gold and pink hues. "They don't know I found you," Thomas explained as they parked. "Amelie, she had a feeling today would be the day." Laura took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. "I'm scared," she confessed. "What if they hate me for leaving? What if they don't recognize me?" Thomas shook his head. Amelie never let the twins forget you. She draws your face, tells them stories about you, keeps you alive in their memories every single day. They entered through the side door. Thomas could hear the children's voices in the living room, Amelie reading something to the twins. "Wait here for a second," he said to Laura, who nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Thomas stepped into the living room. The kids were on a large rug, with Amelie in the middle, a picture book open on her lap. The twins wore the clothes she'd so carefully picked that morning. Amelie looked up when she saw him, a spark of expectation in her eyes. "You came back," she noted. "I promised I would," Thomas replied, feeling the enormity of what was about to happen. "And I brought someone with me." He gestured toward the door. Laura walked in slowly, stopping on the threshold as though she didn't dare take another step. She was clean, her hair brushed, wearing simple but decent clothes. Still, she looked fragile, unsure, fearful of rejection. Time seemed to stand still. Amelie froze, the book forgotten on her lap. The twins, puzzled, glanced from their sister to the newcomer, sensing something important was happening. "Mommy!" Amelie's voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might cause the apparition to vanish. Laura took a hesitant step forward, then another, her legs trembling. "Amelie, my love." What followed was a blur of motion. Amelie leaped up and ran, not with the caution of a child who'd had to grow up too soon, but with the pure abandon of her true 5 years. She threw herself into her mother's arms, who lifted her in a desperate embrace. The twins, initially confused, were drawn in by their sister's emotion and approached timidly. They were too young to have clear memories of their mother, but something instinctive recognized her. "Liam, Luke." Laura extended an arm toward them, still holding Amelie tightly. "My boys." Thomas watched from a distance, unwilling to intrude on this sacred moment of reunion. He saw Laura kneel on the floor, hugging all 3 children at once, tears streaming down her face. He saw the twins, initially timid, surrender to their mother's embrace, and he saw Amelie, his little warrior, finally allow herself to be just a child. In the days that followed, Laura settled in at the shelter with her children. There were no grand emotional displays or extravagant promises about the future, only presents. Presents at bedtime, at meals, in the everyday moments previously filled only by Amelie doing her best to manage everything alone. Thomas visited daily, witnessing the slow rebuilding of that family. He saw Laura relearning how to be a mother, gradually regaining her lost confidence. He saw the twins adapting to her presence, instinctively recognizing the primary source of comfort they'd been missing, and he saw Amelie gradually releasing her adult responsibilities, reclaiming pieces of the childhood that had been stolen from her. It wasn't a magical transformation. Laura bore scars from her ordeal, the illness, the desperation, the relentless struggle to return home. Sometimes, Thomas found her sitting alone in the garden, gazing at nothing, shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of guilt. In those moments, he simply sat beside her, offering silent companionship. One afternoon, almost 2 weeks after the reunion, Thomas found her like that, watching the sunset from a garden bench. "I don't deserve this," Laura said suddenly, still gazing at the horizon. "This second chance, this place, you." Thomas pondered her words. "It's not about deserving," he replied. "No one really deserves what they get in life, whether good or bad." Laura turned to look at him. "Then why? Why did you do all this for us?" Thomas thought about Amelie, dressing her brothers on a sunny morning, sure her mother would return. He thought of the future memories, the unbreakable faith, the resilience that defied logic. "Because your daughter never gave up," he said simply. "She taught me that I shouldn't either." Laura absorbed his words in silence. After a moment, she said, "I'm afraid I'm not strong enough, that I'll fail them again." "You're here," Thomas replied. "That's the first step, the most important one." In that moment, he understood that simply being there, facing her fears, limitations as an overwhelming guilt, was already a profound act of courage. Not the dramatic courage of action movies, but the quiet courage of someone who stands up again after falling, of someone who tries once more despite past failures, of someone who chooses to remain even when running away would be easier. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with the same golden hues of that special day when Amélie had, with her inexplicable wisdom, predicted her mother's return. The shadows in the garden lengthened, but for the first time in a long while, they did not bring fear. Thomas looked at the lit house, where Amélie and the twins were probably having dinner, under Martha's attentive eye. Through the kitchen window, he could see their little silhouettes moving, alive, safe. Beside him, Laura breathed in the fresh evening air, present, imperfect, real, and he knew with absolute certainty that the sunny day had kept its promise. The crescent moon cast a gentle glow through the half-drawn curtains. The shelter was quiet at that late hour. Only the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the old house broke the silence. Thomas had stayed for a late dinner, something he did often these days, arriving after work ended just to check on everyone. That night, after the meal, the adults retreated to the small living room while the twins slept in the room next door. Laura was knitting, a hobby she'd recently discovered that helped calm her anxiety. Thomas flipped through a magazine without interest, drawn more to the tranquility of this domestic moment than to its actual content. Amélie, who had special permission to stay up a bit later, was quietly drawing on the floor between them. Then, without warning, she asked the question that had been lingering for weeks. "Are you going away again?" The question, directed at Laura, shattered the silence like breaking glass. Laura's hands stopped moving, a knitting needle suspended in mid-air. Thomas looked up from the magazine, attuned to the sudden tension. Amélie didn't lift her gaze from her drawing, as if the question were casual, like asking about the weather or tomorrow's dinner. But all the adults in the room felt the weight of those words. Laura set her knitting in her lap, taking a deep breath. She glanced at Thomas, her eyes silently asking for what? Permission? Courage? He nodded slightly, encouraging her. "Amélie," Laura began softly, "can we talk? The three of us." Amélie finally looked up from her drawing, meeting her mother's gaze with that penetrating look that seemed to peer into souls. She nodded once, then climbed onto the armchair beside Laura, leaving her drawing behind on the rug. "You want to know if I'm going away again," Laura said, not as a question. "That's fair. It's fair for you to be afraid." Amélie didn't answer, just watched her mother intently. "I think it's time to tell the truth," Laura continued. "All of it. Why I left that day. Why I didn't come back sooner." Thomas rose, thinking this was a private conversation between mother and daughter, but Laura raised a hand, stopping him. "Stay, please. You need to hear this too." He settled back down, aware of the privilege and the responsibility of witnessing that moment. Laura adjusted her position in the chair, her hands clasped in her lap, knuckles white from the pressure. "Do you remember that day I left for work? You helped me count out the bus fare." Amélie nodded. "You said you were cleaning a big house and would earn enough for a week's worth of food." "Yes," Laura swallowed hard. At that point, it had been 3 days since the boys had eaten anything but rice. The power was cut off. Rent was overdue. Thomas listened, noting how Laura didn't minimize or sugarcoat the facts. There was no self-pity, just a stark account of brutal realities. "On the bus, I started feeling worse. I'd had that cough for weeks, remember? But that day, I couldn't breathe at all. Someone called an ambulance." Amélie sat motionless, her eyes revealing how deeply she was absorbing each word. "I woke up in the hospital. Pneumonia," they said. "I stayed there for nearly 2 weeks. I tried to tell them I had children at home waiting, but..." Laura closed her eyes briefly. "I was too weak, feverish, confused. And I had no way to prove who I was. My ID, my phone, everything had been stolen while I was unconscious." Thomas noticed a subtle change in Amélie's posture, a slight relaxation, as if missing puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place. "When I finally got discharged, I was without money, without ID, in a part of the city I didn't know," Laura went on. "I tried walking back, but it was too far. I asked for help, tried explaining my situation, but..." She shrugged, a gesture that said everything about how the world treats poor, desperate people without documents. "And then?" Amelie prompted when the silence stretched on. Laura took a deep breath. This, Thomas realized, was the hardest part, the confession she dreaded. Then I made a decision, a terrible decision. Her voice trembled for the first time. I thought that if I couldn't get back soon, if you kids were left alone for too long, someone would notice, a neighbor, maybe the school, and you'd be taken to a better place with food, safety. The revelation hung in the air like lead. Thomas felt his heart constrict, fully grasping what Laura was saying. It wasn't just a failed attempt to return home. At some point, driven by desperation and no options, she had concluded that her absence might be better for her children than her presence. I wanted them to take us. Amelie's voice was small but without accusation. No, yes. I don't know. Laura buried her face in her hands for a moment, then lowered them, looking at her daughter through tear-filled eyes. I wanted you to have what I couldn't give, food every day, a roof that didn't leak when it rained, clothes without holes. Thomas watched in silence, unable to look away. He no longer saw in Laura the absent mother he'd initially imagined, but a woman crushed by poverty, circumstances, and a lack of any real choice. A woman who believed that her greatest gift to her children might be disappearing. I thought that if I vanished, the authorities would find you, that you'd all go to a better place, maybe a family who could separate us. Amelie finished calmly, no apparent emotion in her voice. Laura nodded, tears streaming freely now. I was wrong. So wrong. I didn't realize you'd take on everything yourself, that you'd look after the boys without asking for help, that you'd all stay in that shack, going hungry for months. Her voice faltered. I never wanted that. I never wanted you to carry that weight. The silence that followed felt endless. Thomas hardly dared to breathe, aware he was witnessing a moment that would define this small family's future. Amelie remained motionless, face solemn, eyes on her mother. There was no accusation, but neither was there the immediate forgiveness children sometimes offer. There was something deeper, understanding. The understanding of a child forced to see the world with adult eyes. I thought about you every day, Laura said, as though she had to fill that heavy silence. Tried saving money to return. But every time I got a little, something happened. I got sick again, or was robbed, or lost a job. Thomas watched Amelie process all of this, her keen mind connecting the dots, filling in the gaps in the story she'd built on her own. When Thomas found me, Laura glanced briefly at him, gratitude evident in her look. It was like someone finally heard my prayers, like the universe conspired to bring me back to you. Amelie finally moved, sliding down from her chair to stand before her mother. Her eyes, so adult in a child's face, studied Laura as though seeing her for the first time. It wasn't your fault, she said softly but firmly. You got sick. You tried, yes, but after that, Laura hesitated. I thought you'd be better off without me. And that was wrong, Amelie. So wrong. Amelie considered her words for a long moment. Then, in a gesture that stunned both Laura and Thomas, she reached out and took her mother's hand. I waited, Mom, she said simply, and now you're here. It wasn't an effusive pardon. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was something deeper and more genuine, an acceptance of the world's complexity, of the imperfections of love, of the brutal reality that had shaped their lives. Thomas felt something warm and wet on his own face. To his astonishment, he was crying, something he hadn't done since his parents' funeral years ago. Silent tears slid down his cheeks as he watched this improbable reunion. No more than a reunion, the true reconnection of souls. Laura pulled Amelie into a tight hug, sobbing openly. The girl let her small arms encircling her mother's neck, her face pressed into Laura's shoulder. I promise I'll never leave you again, Laura whispered. Never again. Amelie didn't answer in words. She just tightened her hold, as if sealing a silent pact. They stayed that way for a long moment, mother and daughter rebuilding a bond tested, broken, and now beginning to heal. Thomas watched, aware of his role as a witness to this sacred moment. He was no longer just a distant benefactor or an unlikely savior. He was part of this story now, of this imperfect family fighting to piece itself back together in a world that seemed designed to tear them apart. When he finally stood to leave, giving mother and daughter their private moment, Thomas carried with him a new understanding of family, of love, of forgiveness, and he knew with absolute certainty that his own wounds of abandonment, carried since childhood, had begun to heal as well. Thomas walked the corridors of his office building with determined strides. Employees noticed something different in his demeanor, not the usual cool confidence of a calculating executive, but something lighter, more human. In recent months, rumors had circulated about the boss's changed behavior, unannounced cancellations of important meetings, frequent absences, occasional smiles at employees he once barely acknowledged. No one dared ask him outright, of course, but everyone sensed Thomas Parker had changed. That specific morning, he had cancelled every meeting. There was something more important to do. After the conversation between Laura and Amelie, which he'd witnessed 2 weeks prior, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about them living in borrowed space at the shelter. Temporary support was no longer enough. They deserved more. "It's all confirmed," his lawyer said over the phone. "The property transfer is complete. You can pick up the keys today. And the renovations I requested. Finished yesterday. Furniture, utensils, everything as specified. The cleaning crew wrapped up this morning." "Perfect." Thomas hung up, feeling an unusual mix of nerves and satisfaction. He had bought and furnished far bigger properties, mansions, lavish estates, real estate investments worth fortunes, but none had meant as much as this small 3-bedroom house in a quiet middle-class neighborhood. He drove there for a final inspection before picking up Laura and the children. The street was lined with trees, neither too close nor too far from downtown. The house had a simple but well-kept exterior, a small front yard and a more spacious backyard, enough room for 3 children to run around. Inside, it was exactly as he'd requested, comfortable without being ostentatious. Bedrooms with new beds and soft linens, clean bathrooms with fluffy towels, a cozy living room with a sofa and chairs, a dining table where a family could share meals, and a functional kitchen fully equipped with the basics. No unnecessary luxuries, nothing that screamed charity or would make Laura and the kids feel out of place. It was simply a house, a home ready to be lived in. Thomas walked through the rooms one last time, adjusting small details. He straightened a picture on the wall, checked that the pantry and fridge had some basic groceries to last a few days, and made sure the toys he'd bought for the twins were neatly arranged in their shared bedroom. In Amelie's room, he placed a full set of art supplies on the desk. High-quality colored pencils, special drawing pads, paints, brushes. Next to it was a small bookshelf stocked with carefully chosen books for her age. In Laura's room, simplicity reigned. Soft cotton sheets, a discreet bedside lamp, a small dresser. On top of it, in a simple frame, Thomas had placed a restored copy of the faded photo Amelie cherished, Laura holding a baby Amelie. A quiet reminder that the past, despite its hardships, still contained seeds of joy. Satisfied with everything, he took the keys and drove to the shelter. The day was sunny, the sky a clear blue, one of those days that seemed made for fresh starts. Laura stood on the porch when he arrived, watching the twins play on the small lawn under Amelie's watchful eye. She seemed more at peace. Her cheeks had color again, her body had regained healthy curves, and her expression showed cautious hope. "Morning," Thomas greeted her as he climbed the steps. "Nice day, isn't it?" Laura smiled, still a bit timid but more frequent. "Too nice to stay indoors. The kids needed some fresh air." Thomas looked at Amelie, helping one twin, likely Liam, build something out of sticks. Her face was more relaxed now. The constant vigilance had softened, though not entirely disappeared. Some scars, he knew, were hard to erase. "I have a surprise for you," he said to Laura. "Actually, it's more of a decision I've made." Laura gave him a curious look. Over the past weeks, she'd learned not to fear surprises from Thomas. He had never asked for anything in return, never made her feel indebted. "What decision?" Thomas pulled a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "Open it." Laura did so, revealing a set of keys and a folded paper. She opened the paper, a property deed in her name. "What's this?" she asked, confused. "A new beginning," Thomas answered simply. "A house for you and the kids." Laura stared at the deed, then at the keys, then at Thomas, unable to form words. Tears welled up in her eyes. We can't accept this," she finally managed, voice trembling. "It's too much. It's not too much," Thomas said gently. "It's what's needed. You can't stay in the shelter forever. The kids need stability, a place truly their own. And you," he paused, choosing his words, "you deserve a place to rebuild your life, to start over." Laura gazed at the keys in her hand like they were something precious and terrifying at the same time. "I can show it to you today," Thomas went on. "If you'd like. Everything's ready for you to move in." "Today?" Laura sounded stunned. "Whenever you're ready," Thomas corrected. "No rush." At that moment, Amelie noticed the conversation on the porch and approached Aya, curiosity evident. "What's going on?" she asked, studying her mother's tearful face. Laura tried to answer, but no words came. Thomas crouched down to Amelie's level. "I found a house for you," he explained. "A home that's just yours, not a shelter, not a borrowed space, a real house." Amelie's eyes went wide, the weight of that revelation sinking in. "Our own house, just ours." "Only yours," Thomas confirmed. "With bedrooms for everyone, a yard to play in, a kitchen where your mum can bake that cake she mentioned she knows how to make." Amelie looked at her mother, then at Thomas, then at the twins, who had come closer, drawn by the excitement. "Can we see it?" she asked, voice small but determined. 2 hours later, Thomas's car stopped in front of the house. Seen from the outside, it looked even more welcoming under the afternoon light. The windows reflecting the sun, the small porch inviting. "Here?" Laura asked, disbelief clear in her tone. "Here," Thomas confirmed. Amelie was the first to hop out, followed closely by the twins. They paused at the low gate, eyes wide as they took in the sight. "Let's go," Thomas encouraged, opening the gate. "It's waiting for you." Laura hesitated only a moment before following the kids down the short path leading to the front door. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid the key into the lock. The door opened into a simple, welcoming entryway. The unmistakable scent of a freshly cleaned home mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Thomas had set the coffee maker to start just before they arrived, a small touch meant to make the house feel instantly more inviting. "It smells like coffee," Laura noted, taking a deep breath. "And of a new home," Thomas added. "Your home." It was as though his words broke a spell. Amelie suddenly bolted inside, dragging the twins along. Their footsteps echoed in the hallway as they explored every room, every corner, every detail. "There's a bedroom for the boys," she shouted from somewhere inside. "And there are toys." Laura followed the sound of her daughter's voice, still in disbelief. Thomas stayed behind, giving them space to take it in on their own terms. The noises from the bedrooms told the story. Exclamations of surprise, contained laughter, the sound of drawers opening and closing, curtains being pulled aside. Amelie reappeared in the hallway, her eyes shining with excitement. "I have my own room," she announced, as though it were a marvel of the world. "And there are colored pencils, lots of them." Before Thomas could respond, she ran off again to explore more, the twins trailing behind her like excited shadows. Laura came back to the entryway, tears streaming down her cheeks in silent gratitude. "Why?" she asked simply. Thomas considered the question. Why indeed? Why invest so much time, money, and emotional energy in this particular family, among countless others in similar situations? Why let them into his life so deeply? "Because you deserve more than a shelter," he replied at last. "You deserve a home." Laura absorbed his words quietly. Then, in a gesture that took Thomas by surprise, she reached out and lightly touched his arm. "Thank you," she said, the single word carrying everything she couldn't express. 6 weeks later, Thomas parked in front of the house on a Sunday afternoon. It had become a ritual, regular visits, usually on weekends, always with a small gift in hand. A book for Amelie, a toy for the twins, a plant for the garden Laura had started. The house had changed noticeably in those weeks, not in any grand structural way, but in the little touches that make a space a home. Amelie's drawings framed on the walls, toys neatly stored in colorful boxes, flowers in repurposed vases, the aroma of home-cooked meals. Thomas knocked softly before using the key Laura insisted he keep. For emergencies, she had said, though both knew it also symbolized that he was welcome any time. The smell of fresh coffee greeted him as he stepped inside. "Thomas!" the twins cried in unison, running to hug his legs. Over the past weeks, they had begun to open up, their personalities shining through. Liam was the bolder one, the first to try new games. Luke was the observer, who loved to sit on Thomas's lap and listen to stories. "Did you bring cake?" Liam asked, getting straight to the point. Thomas chuckled, pulling a small bakery box from his coat pocket. "Maybe." The boys cheered and dashed back to the living room to announce the good news. Thomas followed, finding Amelie and Laura at the table, surrounded by paper and colored pencils. "We're drawing the house," Amelie explained, holding up her sketch for Thomas to see. It was a detailed portrait of their home, the windows, the yard with bright flowers, and 4 figures holding hands out front: Laura, Amelie, and the twins. Off to the side, but definitely part of the scene, there was a 5th figure. "Is that me?" Thomas asked, pointing. Amelie nodded. "You don't live here, but you're still part of it," she said, with her trademark simple logic that never ceased to amaze him. Laura smiled, rising to get cups for the coffee. Thomas noticed her apron, a mundane detail that somehow symbolized the normalcy now infusing their home. "How was your first week at the new job?" he asked Laura, sitting down as she poured coffee. Her smile widened. "Good. Better than I expected. The bakery owner is patient, and he liked the bread I made during the test. It was a significant achievement, Laura's first official employment in years, at a bakery just a few blocks away. A small step by the world's standards, but a giant leap for a woman who, months ago, had lived on the streets without ID or hope. "Can I visit you at work tomorrow?" Amelie asked, not looking up from her drawing. "After school, I promise not to be in the way." "Sure," Laura agreed, taking a seat again. "Mr. Gomez said you could sample the fresh cookies." Thomas observed the interaction, feeling a familiar warmth spread in his chest. It was such a simple scene, mother and child discussing everyday plans. Yet for this specific family, it represented a normalcy that once felt impossible. "It's different now," Laura said softly, as though reading his mind. "I have somewhere to come back to at the end of the day." The simplicity of that statement struck Thomas with unexpected force. Having a place to come back to, not just a physical shelter, but a home, a center of gravity, a point of return, something he himself, despite owning properties around the world, rarely felt. The afternoon went by peacefully. The twins played on the living room rug. Amelie continued drawing, occasionally showing off a particularly well-executed detail. Laura and Thomas spoke quietly about day-to-day matters: school, her new job, the garden starting to bloom. There were no big declarations, no dramatic moments, just shared existence, the birth of a routine, ordinary life in its extraordinarily simple form. When the twins finally grew tired and fell asleep on the couch, and Amelie became absorbed in her new book, Laura turned to Thomas with a more determined look in her eyes. "We'll never be able to repay you for everything you've done," she said softly. Thomas shook his head. "That was never the point." "I know. That's what makes it so—" Laura searched for the right word. "Special, what we have here." Thomas understood what she meant. They weren't exactly a family, not in the traditional sense. He wasn't the father or an uncle or even a distant relative. He was a stranger who, through a series of coincidences and choices, had become an integral part of their lives. "We're not a family," Laura went on, voicing his own thoughts. "But we have a bond, a connection, something that doesn't have a name, but it has meaning." Thomas nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. That was exactly what they had, a nameless bond, but one of deep significance. For the first time in a long while, perhaps since his parents' death, Thomas didn't feel like a visitor in his own life. He wasn't simply someone moving through experiences, accumulating successes and conquering goals. He was present, connected, alive. Laura looked up and smiled, a warm, sincere smile filled with unspoken gratitude. Thomas smiled back, suddenly at peace. That ordinary moment, coffee on a Sunday afternoon, drawings scattered across the table, sleepy children on the couch, held more reality, more truth, more life than any million-dollar deal he'd ever closed. It was the start of something new. Not a heroic rescue story, not a fairy tale with a perfect ending, but something more valuable because it was imperfect, unfinished, evolving. It was real life. And for Thomas, for Laura, for Amélie, and the twins, after so much time in the shadows, that was more than enough. It was everything. The seasons changed softly like turning pages of a book. Winter gave way to spring, now in full bloom, covering the small backyard with colors that once existed only in Amélie's drawings. 3 months had passed since they moved in. 3 months of laying down roots, of establishing routines, of building a normal life day by day, brick by brick, moment by moment. The neighborhood school, initially so intimidating for Amélie, had become familiar ground, not without its challenges, of course. In her first weeks, she remained aloof, quietly observing other students with that cautious vigilance that had become her trademark. "She has trouble connecting with the other kids," the teacher explained during a meeting with Laura, which Thomas discreetly attended. "It's like they speak different languages." Indeed, they did. Amélie had grown up in a world where survival was the only language that mattered. Casual games, trivial conversations, playful competitions, none of that was in her vocabulary. But slowly, bit by bit, the doors began to open. First came Julia, a quiet girl like her who reached out during art class, drawn by Amélie's intricate drawings. Then came Michael, a boy who had recently lost his father and perhaps recognized a companion in grief. Finally, Louisa, outgoing and talkative, who adopted Amélie as a friend and included her in all activities with unrelenting persistence. "I have friends now," Amélie announced one afternoon, casually, as though remarking on the weather. But the sparkle in her eyes revealed how monumental that achievement was. For the twins, adapting was more natural. At 4 years old, their resilience worked wonders. At first, they panicked when separated from Laura or Amélie, a lingering effect of having been abandoned. But as days turned into weeks of safety, routine, and small but constant assurances, they opened up to the world. The local preschool became their domain. Liam, always the bolder one, led expeditions around the playground. Luke, the observer, won the teachers' hearts with surprisingly insightful comments for someone so small. "They don't have nightmares anymore," Laura told Thomas during one of his regular visits. Not since the second month here. Laura's own progress might have been the most impressive of all. The bakery job, initially just a way to pay the bills, revealed an unexpected calling. Her hands, once burdened by the weight of survival, had a natural flair for the delicate processes of dough, ingredients, and the art of transforming the simple into the extraordinary. "Ms. Laura," her supervisor said one morning, "I have a proposal for you." It was a professional baking course, partially sponsored by the bakery, an investment in the talent her boss had noticed from the start. "I'm not sure I can do it," Laura confided to Thomas that night after the children were in bed. "The course is on Saturdays." "Who would watch the kids?" "I will," Thomas offered without hesitation. Laura looked up, surprised not by the offer itself, but by how naturally he made it. "Are you sure?" "They're kids, Thomas. Noisy, messy, unpredictable." He smiled. "I've run multinational corporations for years. I think I can handle a few hours with 3 children." Laura laughed, a sound that was becoming more common, more genuine with each passing day. "Don't underestimate them, especially Liam. He might be little, but he's strategic." And so, another door opened. On Saturdays, while Laura delved into the world of pastries and confections, Thomas ventured into the equally intricate realm of children's weekend activities. He took the 3 to the park, the community library, and on small neighborhood outings. At first, he felt awkward, painfully aware of his every movement and word, clueless about the unspoken rules of childhood. But the children proved patient teachers. Amelie, especially, with her observant nature, noticed when he was floundering and would discreetly step in. "That's not how you push a swing, Thomas," she explained one morning at the park, demonstrating the right technique to push the twins. "You need to be gentler. They're small." Little lessons like that, offered without judgment, just helpful information, filled Thomas's Saturdays with a kind of learning that no elite university or executive training program could provide. At home, despite his regular presence, Thomas was careful never to overstep. He helped with practical matters, enrolling Amelie in school when Laura felt overwhelmed by the forms, negotiating the house insurance, offering advice on how to establish credit after years of having no documents, but always in a supportive role, never the lead. It was Laura who handled daily decisions, who set rules, who made routines, who decided what the kids would or wouldn't do, what they would eat when they would sleep, who managed the modest but sufficient budget, learning the delicate art of financial balance, who, day by day, reclaimed not just her dignity, but her position as the core of the family. And Thomas watched her with an admiration he'd never felt for any CEO or mogul. The admiration for someone who, having fallen so far, found the strength to rise again and, more than that, to lift 3 other lives with her. On a golden late summer afternoon, Thomas arrived for one of his visits and found the house empty. An irrational panic seized him. Had they left? Disappeared? His mind, conditioned by decades of bracing for the worst, spun into worst-case scenarios. Then he heard a soft laugh coming from the backyard. He walked around the house and found Amelie sitting on the top step of the back porch, gazing at the sky as it transitioned into sunset colors. "Hey," he greeted, sitting beside her. "Where is everyone?" "Mom took the boys to buy new shoes," Amelie explained. "I wanted to stay. They take too long picking shoes." Thomas smiled, imagining the scene, the twins racing around a shoe store, Laura trying to restore order. "So you're here enjoying the peace and quiet?" Amelie nodded, her eyes still on the shifting colors of the horizon. "It's good quiet here," she said softly. Thomas waited, sensing there was more behind her words. "In the shack, quiet was bad," she continued after a moment. "That's when we'd hear the things outside, people fighting, stuff breaking, rain leaking in." Thomas remained silent, letting her set the pace. "Here, it's not like that. This quiet is different. Like a warm blanket, not a monster waiting." The simplicity of her metaphor hit him with unexpected force. Good silence. Silence as protection, not threat. The absence of noise as the presence of peace, rather than a prelude to danger. They stayed like that for a while, side by side, in good silence, watching the sky change colors. A few days later, he got the invitation, a note drawn by Amelie, formally delivered during one of his casual visits. "You are invited to a special lunch on Sunday." "Is it someone's birthday?" Thomas asked, curious. Laura shook her head. "Not exactly, more like a celebration that we're here, that we've gotten this far." Sunday arrived under a clear blue sky, free of clouds. Thomas showed up right on time, bringing a bottle of wine for the adults and a small bouquet of wildflowers from a street vendor. The house smelled delicious, something roasted, savory herbs, that unmistakable aroma of home, impossible for any professional perfumer to replicate. Laura greeted him at the door, wearing a simple but pretty dress, her hair in a loose bun with a few strands framing her face. She looked younger, lighter, as though each day of stability and safety had gently erased traces of the years spent just surviving. "Welcome," she said with a genuine smile. "Come in. The boys are excited. They said they have a surprise." The dining table was set with obvious care, a simple white tablecloth, the nicest dishes, neatly folded paper napkins shaped into little boats, clearly Amelie's handiwork, a pitcher of orange juice decorated with lemon slices, and newly drawn pictures taped to the walls, scenes from their current life, the house, the garden, everyday moments turned into art by Amelie's talented hands. "Sit here," Liam commanded, leading Thomas to the seat at the head of the table. "It's for the special guest." Luke, quieter, nodded solemnly. as if confirming his brother's statement. The lunch that followed was simple and extraordinary all at once. Laura had prepared a roast with potatoes and vegetables, not fancy but perfectly made. And for dessert, a masterpiece of a cake, decorated with the sophisticated techniques she had learned in her baking course. But it wasn't the food that made the moment special. It was the tone of their conversations, the laughter that filled the room, the feeling that nobody there had to fight for mere existence anymore. The twins chatted about preschool, talking over each other in their excitement. Amélie told stories about her friends at school, a science project she was working on, and a book her teacher had recommended. Laura spoke about the course, her colleagues at work, modest future plans filled with measured hope. Thomas listened more than he spoke, watching the twins, more confident, louder, more childlike. He noted how Amélie seemed to grow a bit each day, not just physically but in her capacity to simply be a 6-year-old instead of a miniature adult. He saw Laura, serene in the small gestures of everyday care, serving, listening, smiling. The cake was sliced, complimented, savored. Nobody was in a hurry. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, creating golden patterns on the floor. It was a common scene, almost ordinary, a family and a friend sharing a Sunday meal. Yet for all of them, it was a monumental victory. Thomas thought back to the beginning of it all, the desperate plea from a child on the street, "Please take one of them with you." A small request born of utter desperation, and everything that followed, the shack, the search for the mother, the shelter, this house, this life painstakingly rebuilt. Enormous. It had all been enormous. As evening approached and the twins, exhausted by all the excitement, dozed on the couch, Thomas got ready to leave. Laura walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "It meant a lot to the kids, and to me." Thomas nodded. Words seemed inadequate to express what he felt. "You know," Laura continued, glancing back at the living room, where Amélie was quietly tidying up. "When Thomas found me, I thought he was saving me, saving my kids." She smiled, a smile tinged with hard-won wisdom. "But now I see that's not exactly what happened." "No?" Thomas asked, curious. "No, you didn't save us, Thomas. You saw us, really saw us. And you helped us save ourselves." The distinction was subtle but deeply significant. Thomas felt his chest swell with emotion he couldn't name. "I think you did the same for me," he admitted, because it was true. Before Amélie, Laura, and the twins, his life had been a string of hollow achievements, collecting wealth and status without purpose. He existed but wasn't really living. Walking out into the cool evening air, Thomas understood at last he hadn't saved anyone, but he had learned to be present, truly connected, truly alive. And that, for all of them, had been more than enough. The doors that opened were not just the ones to this house or the local school or the bakery. They were the inner doors, the ones leading to the possibility of trusting again, hoping again, truly living again. Looking up at the starry sky, Thomas smiled. Good silence, he thought. Exactly that. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.